Last week, if you weren't with us, we talked about what does it really mean to love God and love others. And we said that that's the foundation, because until we learn to do that, nothing else matters. It's kind of funny. Like, I'm talking, everyone all of a sudden went like this. Like, wow, this room got bigger all of a sudden. Okay, so if you have ADD or anything like that, focus. Okay, it's going to be okay. It was a lot worse last week if you made it through that. But so as we start off today, I brought an object with me because I wanted to ask you some questions about this object to see if we could come to an understanding with it. First of all, what is this object? The way the Ravens play this might be what they're throwing. You put the garage door up, and I just came driving right through it. So, yes, most of you would say probably a ball. I would disagree with you. I think it's something that you put under your bum so it doesn't hurt if you're sitting. But most importantly, it's a pillow. So if you're tired, this is not a ball. Can we agree with that? Why not? Okay, fine. You all be wrong. All right. What color is it? It's purple, lavender, Ravens purple. So maybe it's not purple. You know, maybe you're colorblind. Maybe you don't see this purple or purplish. That's pretty cool. What shape is it? It's another door open for a Ravens joke. All right, so it's so anyways, all right, we get it. There's going to be difficulty. So anyways, yes, most of you said it's a ball, it's purple, and it's round. But there were some things you couldn't agree with. As I started to mesh it, it wasn't so round anymore. It was kind of roundish. Or it wasn't purple, it was purplish. But you're convinced it's a ball. Why are you convinced it's a ball? Because most balls are round, and everyone's always told you a round thing is probably a ball, and we use it like a ball, right? But maybe it's really not meant to be a ball. Maybe that's just how we intended to use it, and you just assume it's a ball. My point is this. When it comes to culture, there's a lot of times where we see things, but we all see things differently. And so some of you may say this is a ball, and I could say, no, I see it like a pillow, which it's not really a comfortable pillow, but some of you see it as one color, some of you see it as another. Or, you know, maybe the shape, and we can change those things. And that's kind of what happens in society is as people go through life, things get this true-ish kind of shape, color, whatever it may be, and we begin to define what is true and what's not. So we want to look at that today. And so, it must be a ball. It rolled. But it's interesting at times that we believe things just because that's what people tell us to believe. And then the question becomes, why do we really believe it? And we want to explore that option today. But let me ask you these two questions as we start. How many of you have ever been lied to? Okay, how many of you have ever lied to someone? Now, if you don't have the perspective unless you're in the very back like I do because you get to see everyone, how many have been lied to? Oh, yeah. How many of you lied to someone? Maybe. So what happens is, we begin to assume that, yeah, everybody lies, but then maybe I don't lie as much as the other person. And so as we look at this today, you can obviously tell that sometimes we don't know what the truth is. Maybe it's someone that you live with. You know, kids are really good at sometimes expanding the truth or whatever you want to call it. And they believe that what they're telling you is true. And they kind of get around things. So we say, well, maybe something's a lie, but it's not really a big lie, it's a white lie. And so it becomes this true-ish kind of thought. And so today, what happens is, I want us to evaluate our hearts based on what we talked about last week. We'll refer back to that. But really look at today, what does it mean to live out truth in our lives? And so the first thing that we have to do is this. We have to understand there's a choice. Just like anything in life, we talked last week about choosing to love God or choosing to love the world. Today, we have to have a choice. And if we say we love God, then we have to choose truth. And if we don't love God, we have to choose what we think is truth. And so we're going to look at that today. But the first thing is this. Culture defines truth and honesty. Culture has a problem with truth and honesty. Would you agree with that? You better, because you all said they lied to you. So obviously there's a problem with telling the truth in our society. And so as I went through this, I wanted to look at several areas where sometimes truth is skewed. And maybe some of these things you believe in as an individual, as a family. My goal today is just to get us to think, but then to look at what Scripture says. And so the first thing I want to look at, what are some individual lies that society kind of tells us we have to believe? Number one is you matter. You matter. It's all about you. Everything is about you. When you turn on the TV today, you watch commercials, it's all about you. You can become this. You can be this. You can do that. And if you don't believe it, just listen when people talk. It always comes back to who? Them, you. Because we believe we matter. We believe like we're the culmination of all that is humanity, and everyone else just doesn't get it. So we believe to see that. Number two, everybody's doing it. You know, if you want to be part of this, if you want to be accepted, you need to do A, B, or C. If you know, everybody's doing whatever it is, but you want to be part of it, so therefore you have to do it. So you need to go buy this so that you can be like everybody else. You need to wear this so you look like everybody else. Whatever it may be, everybody's doing it. Number three, it will not hurt anyone else. Whatever you choose to do is okay because it won't hurt anyone else. Because why? It's all about you. And so we believe the things I choose to do, it probably won't hurt someone else, so it's okay if I do it. Or we just don't think if it will hurt anyone, we don't care. How about this fourth one? I'm not a bad person. Have you ever met anyone who really admits they're a bad person in our society? People all think they're good. If you don't believe me, ask them. They'll say, well, I do a lot of good things. And then what we start to do is they start to compare life to other people. And you can always find someone who's worse than you. Always. And you can always feel better about yourself at the end of the day. And so that's what people do. And how about this last one when it comes to individuals? No one has the right to tell me how to live my life. Or as my kids say, you're not the boss of me. They love saying that to each other. Like one tells them what to do, you're not the boss of me. No, but guess who is? So you need to listen. But yeah, we say those things like, you can't tell me what to do. You ever met anyone like that? Like they'll do whatever they want to do and no one can tell them any different. They're always right. And so people begin to believe these individual lies. And so what we do is we uplift ourselves to thinking that we're up here somewhere because we believe what society tells us. Or just society in a whole, people believe they're up here. The second one is this. How about societal lies? Like, what are things that society says to us that we know or should believe as Christians that is true? Number one, the biggest one I can think of is the fact that marriage is no longer just between a man and a woman in our society. You know, I look back, and 17 years ago, as I walked out of high school, I never thought we would be here where we're at today, as far as defining marriage, or redefining marriage, as they like to call it. And it's interesting they have to say redefining because it means a definition was already given. It's kind of weird. And so I thought back when I was in high school, if someone was to say, this is what I believe, or this is who I am, you were almost ostracized or picked at for believing that or having that lifestyle, whereas today, it's celebrated, and the fact is, if we don't accept it, then we're wrong, and we're called names. As a matter of fact, there's some states that try to pass legislation that if pastors speak against homosexuality, we could be considered hate language. This is happening in our own country. So it's amazing how things have changed that we've allowed society to say, hey, this is what is true, or this is what is not true. How about this one? Life does not begin at conception. That's a big one that many people believe, which is interesting. All right, now we're going to go educational for a second. So for some of you, this was a lot longer ago than for others. But if you were sitting in a science class, what did they always tell you? Life came from life, right? Living things reproduce, living things. Cells continue to grow and they live. But then all someone said, we're going to make a time that designates when something becomes actual life. And so they redefined science. And as a society, we're like, that makes sense. But it really doesn't. And so people begin to believe these things. And so people are revising things and changing it. How about this? How about political lies? How about when people get up and just come out and they say certain things as far as what is true to believe or not? I have a friend who works in an inner city, runs a ministry there. And in this city, they have convinced the people if they were ever to vote outside of a certain political party, that city will be much worse off. But the city already has decaying buildings, abandoned cars everywhere, streets crumbling, drugs being dealt right out in public. It's horrendous what happens in this neighborhood, but yet the people believe if they were ever to change, life would be worse. They believe a lie. Some of the other things, how about the value of life? It was interesting. I had a student ask me the other day, they said, Pastor Brian, I've been asking people a question. I want to ask you your perspective. Anytime a student asks that question, you never know what's going to come out, all right? So I did what anyone would do, and I said, what is it? And asked. And they said, I want to know what you think about Syria and what's going on. And I thought about it, and I had really thought about that, and I thought, here's an opportunity to really say something to this student. And I'm not here to give you any political agenda. I just want you to think differently for a second. And I said, here's my thing. If those people really did do to their people what they did with weapons, that's wrong. But I said, what I have a problem with is the United States of America standing up and calling it an atrocity and horrendous what these people chose to do, when every day we let thousands of innocent children be massacred in our country. And I said, the problem isn't people using weapons. The problem is the definition and the value of life. And the problem in our culture, in our society, in our world as a whole, isn't weapons, it's life. We devalue life as a society. To which I got the response, dude, that was real deep. I don't know. I said, at the core of everything, there's an issue. And the issue is we no longer value life. And it starts at a young age with what kids watch, what they do. And I said, that's where our issue lies, is that we're going to be hypocrites and say, what you're doing is wrong, but what we're doing is okay. And I said, we got to get back to valuing life the way people and the way Jesus intends us to value life. And I said, that's what we're called to do. And so we have all these things that are out there that culture believes. The problem is, if culture, and I don't mean because you guys are in this section like you're the worldly. This is just, the goats will be on the left. And this is my left. So you're worldly. No, but I confused that. Random. All right, here we go. So the world says all these things are true. And this is what they're believing. But yet as Christians, we're over here and we're saying, yeah, but I believe everything about God is true. But the problem isn't that as much as most Christians are doing this. I believe God is true, but I also believe some of this stuff. And this is where we end up with what we call this truish belief of like, I think I kind of believe a little bit of all of it. And just like we talked about last week, when it comes to loving God, you either love God with everything or you love the world. Why? Because whoever makes himself a friend to the world is an enemy to God. You can't have both. So guess what? If love is the foundation of everything we do, then when it comes to truth and how we speak truth and honesty, you can't have a truish life. You either follow God or you don't. And so we come to 2 Timothy chapter 4, and we're going to look at this passage and a couple others this morning. So as we get into this, like I told you last week, this series spurred out of some things God's done in my life, and as Pastor Dave and I were talking and praying things and things we've dealt with when it comes to people. And like we said last week, if you weren't here, we talked about loving God, and we said this: until you love God with every ounce of your being, until you learn to love people the way God does, none of the rest of this will ever fall in place. It just can't happen because everything is based on his love and what he did and us following that. So that's kind of the very basic cliff notes of last week. But here's the thing. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 through 4. And I want you to hear this. And then we're going to come back and tear it apart and look at it a little bit deeper. But it says, the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires. And they will turn away their ears from the truth and turn aside to myths. And so when we look at this, here's Paul writing to this young Timothy, this young man who's doing the work of God, and then it's written also to us who would come after and read this, that there was obviously some false teaching that was happening. And so when we look at it, the first thing it says is this. It says, the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. Well, the first question is, the time's already here. The minute that sin happened in the world, people didn't endure sound doctrine. So it's not like this is all of a sudden a new revelation, but here's what he's saying is this. We have to ask the question, what is sound doctrine? And as you go further and you look into Paul's writings and you understand, I'm giving you everything here because we don't have time to go through all the passages. When Paul talks about sound doctrine, he's talking about Christ. He's the center of Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what he's saying is, a time will come when people will not endure Christ, the gospel. What happened? Why? Because the gospel centered completely on Christ and what he did. And people believe that if I can disprove Christ, I can disprove Christianity. And that's why Christ is attacked. As a matter of fact, if you know anything about religion, philosophy, or false cults, guess what? They don't agree on anything except for one thing. Christians are wrong. Isn't that weird? They don't agree on what they believe, their teachings, who they follow, but they know one thing: Christians have to be wrong. Why? Because if we can disprove Christ, we can disprove that faith, and we can prove it all incorrect and wrong. And so they attack that. So it says, this time will come where they will not endure sound doctrine. They won't follow the truth. They won't want to know the truth. And he says, as a result, here's what the people are doing. The next thing he says is, they want to have their ears tickled. Now, the way I look at it this way isn't necessarily like a real tickling of the ears, but you want to hear the things you want to hear. It's kind of like your kids. You know, sometimes, and I understand there's some kids in here, and they all know it, they have selective hearing, right? You tell them to do something, and then they don't do it. And I thought I told you this. Oh, is that what you said? Or it's even better. How about when you tell your kid to do something, and they do this? Da 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 da. You ever had anyone do that to you? And then as soon as you stop talking, they pull their fingers out of their ears, and you start again, and they're like da 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 da, and they just don't want to hear what you have to say. Well, that's kind of what it's the image you get here is that over here Paul's saying you have to teach the truth, but yet there's going to be people standing there going da 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 da. I don't want to hear what you have to say. Why? Because I want to only hear what I want to hear. And then the natural thing becomes, well, how are they going to do that? Well, the very next thing he says that they're going to do is they're going to accumulate for themselves teachers. In other words, they're going to go find people who say what they want to hear. It's kind of like this. You walk into a huge buffet at the beach. You know, they're just better at the beach for some reason. You know, they got ships or whatever, food beyond whatever you can see. I mean, it's just everywhere. And you look in here, you're like, man, what am I going to eat tonight? You know, it's just there. And you watch people as they go through, and you got the people who meticulously put everything on their plate. You got the people who heap everything on there, and then they're going back to their table so they don't spill it. But that's what happens. Well, guess what? When it comes to religion, philosophy, worldviews, this is what people do. I like a little bit of that with a little bit of this, and I'll take a little bit of that. And then what you have is what a lot of people hold today. And you don't have people who follow God. You don't have people who necessarily follow the world. What they have is this man-made self-religion, meaning I take everything I like from everywhere, from the buffet of life, of religion, and I put it on my plate, and that's what I believe. And it becomes my religion. It becomes my faith. And so that's what a lot of people do today. That's a very popular belief that people do. Even people in the church who've grown up in the church, who think they know the scriptures, you sit down and talk with them, and you find even half the stuff they say is not even in the Bible. It's like little quips from society that they've heard along the way, and it's like, that's not a Bible verse. But they're convinced that that's what truth is. And so, you know, that's the thing. So the first thing is they're not going to listen to what truth really is. They want their ears tickled, so they go find it. Wherever they can find it, they go get it from. And then the last thing it says is this, that they will turn away from truth to myths. Now, here's the problem when we get to that. So often we want to bash the false teachers, the false religions. Guess what? If nobody was willing to listen to them, they wouldn't have a voice. So we can't just sit around and say, well, there's false teachers, there's false religions. There's people who want to hear what they're teaching. And sadly, even in churches today, there's a lot of false teaching happening. We talked about this as a church where people don't want to listen to what the gospel is. It becomes a you-centered gospel, meaning what do? It's about you. Guess what? It's not. In the Bible, it's all about Jesus Christ. And so we have churches today trying to marry world truth with gospel truth, and it can't happen. And so we're selling people short, and people are walking out of churches thinking, man, I'm a Christian, and yet they would die and go to hell because they don't know real truth. And so the first thing is obviously our culture has a problem with honesty and truth. And there's two main false views in our society. And I want to define those for us and talk about them for a few seconds. The first one is this: relativism. Relativism, is that a term most of you have heard? How many have heard that term before, relativism? Okay. You guys are a good crowd. More hands in this one. That or you just don't want to be the person that doesn't raise your hand like you were in school. So, relativism is this. It's the assumption that there is no such thing as absolute truth. In other words, as Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ is the only truth. We're going to talk about that a little later. Society would say that's wrong. You can't believe that because there is no such thing as absolute truth. Truth for you may be truth different than someone else. You can't dictate truth for any one person, except they can tell us as Christians that what we believe isn't true, which is kind of weird. So you have this idea of relativism. Consider this. What used to be wrong before that's pretty much accepted today? Have you ever really looked at society? What was wrong before that's accepted today? And so even in the church, and what happens is this. If you bring the church up and put it right beside the world, some ways our lifestyles aren't any different. We profess to believe something different and live by something different, but yet the outcomes really aren't the same. So in other words, let's just take this for an example. People live together. More and more people in the church decide to live together than get married. Why? Because culture says it's okay. So they do it because culture says it's all right. There's many other things too that people may choose to do, but the point is you either believe what the world says or you believe what God says. So the relativism. One of these other words that's come up with relativism is tolerance. Now, looking around this room, we have many different age demographics, which is a great thing. Because some of you remember tolerance from back in the 50s and all. Tolerance didn't mean what it means today. You know, it was being tolerant of, a different race or a culture. Today, tolerant means this. I have to believe and let you do whatever you want to do and accept it as right. And here's how Christians have bought into this. And maybe you've said this or heard someone say this. That person can do whatever they want to do as long as they leave me alone. If that's what makes them happy, fine. Really? What do you think Jesus would do if he was here? Well, when Jesus was on earth and people didn't do his right, he flipped tables, he called them a brood of vipers, whitewashed tombs. He wasn't going around playing hippie Jesus like we think he did. He was getting pretty aggressive saying, look, here's what truth is, here's what it is, and a matter of fact, here's what you've done in my church. So churches that aren't preaching the truth, guess what? He'd come in and start flipping things upside down saying, this isn't right. Because he said exactly what they had done to the temple before. But yet that's how we do things. We're like, well, if they choose to do that, it's okay. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. The next one is this, subjectivism. And it means this, that nobody has the right to determine what is right or wrong in my life. There's no authority that can tell me what's right or wrong in my life. Why do you think that's such a popular belief? Because if no one can tell you if you're right or wrong, guess who you're accountable to? Yourself, nobody else. That's great. I'm always right. Woohoo. Why can't everyone be just like me? Why can't everyone just get it the way I get it? And so there's no accountability for it. And it goes back to the fact is, well, if nobody can do that, then I'll go listen to whatever I want. I'll get the teachers that I want to hear from. I'll go get my ears tickled where I want to get them tickled because guess what? It doesn't matter. You can't tell me I'm wrong for doing that. Well, as a Christian, if you believe that, then you really have a skewed love of God. And actually, you don't really have a love for God then at that point, as we talked about last week. Consider this. When it comes to how our society has defined this, we're talking about the value of life, correct? Why is it in our society, and please just listen to what I'm about to say, why is it in our society that we want to applaud and let someone choose to walk into a clinic and commit murder and say it's okay, but if someone shoots somebody on the street today, we're up in arms about it? In our society, it's even different from this standpoint. A couple years ago, a lady was pregnant, and she got killed, and the fetus died, and the guy was charged with double homicide. I'm sitting thinking, wait a minute. In society, now why is that life all of a sudden? Because someone said, well, now it's life, and you get a stricter punishment if it's double homicide. See how we've messed things up? And sadly, we can't say, well, culture's got to change. Culture's not going to change, because why? It's sin. They don't know any better. But yet over here, we have the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, yet we don't change anything. We just fall in line with it and say, well, if they choose to do it, it's their life. Really? And we become very flippant about truth as a society and as Christians. And so the first thing is this, and think of it this way too. When culture comes to redefining, how many of you have known someone, you don't have to raise your hands, you've known someone who was like, this is wrong, this shouldn't happen, and then all of a sudden they changed? Why? Because of the person who was doing the sin. You ever experienced something like that? Like and you're thinking, wait a minute, you always said this was wrong before, why is it right now? Because their heartstrings get pulled. And see, here's what I believe the problem is, as a society and as Christians, and we're going to talk about this, is that, and this is the second thing we're leaning into, is the church has a problem with truth and honesty, is because of this. Our heartstrings play on us. See, it's not based on our love for God. What we think is we love people more. And so therefore, when it comes to things like sin, we don't confront it. Why? Well, geez, Pastor Brian, that person may never talk to me again. Oh, poor you. They may not like me anymore. Oh, darn. You laugh, but you know people who do that, right? Maybe you've done that. Like, you know what someone is doing, a fellow Christian, someone else is wrong, even someone in this world, you know you have truth that you can share with them, and yet you don't do anything with it. Why? Because they might not like you at the end of the day. That's the worst thing that's going to happen to you, is they may not like you. They may be offended by that. Here's the thing. We know culture is going to have a problem with honesty and truth because they're sinful. But yet, as Christians, if we proclaim to follow truth and understand truth, why do we have an issue with it? I mean, that messes with your mind. Like, why do we have such a problem with it? And so here's the thing. Because we don't approach sin, it goes back to what we talked about last week. Remember what we said? If you weren't here, we said that we're to love God with everything we have up here. Everything, your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. You're to love God with everything. As a result of you loving God with everything you have, you love people the way that God loves people. And the more you love people, your love for God grows. Why? So in the hopes that you can go back and tell them more about God. And so it becomes cyclical, as we talked about. I love God, I love people, love God. It just keeps going because you can't do one without the other. And so if we're going to go back and we're going to say, well, I love God with everything I had, like we talked about last week, but you're not willing to step up and say what is true, and you're not willing to call sin, sin, and you're not willing to hold someone accountable, and we're not willing to give people who are dying and going to hell the truth, I'm sorry to tell you, you don't love people, which means you don't love God. Because if you love God, you want to tell them all about it. It's just one of those things where everything's foundation on the love of Christ. Why? Because as we talked about last week, everything he did was based on his love for us when he died on the cross. And we're supposed to live our lives according to that. And so as we get into this, go to John chapter 18. We're going to look at two passages in John here as we go through this. And so the church has a problem with truth and honesty. Well, here's why. Because we don't understand who Jesus is. Because here's the next point. Jesus embodies truth. Jesus embodies truth. Everything about Jesus is true. And so we come to John chapter 18. It's probably one you've read, a passage you've read before. Maybe you haven't. But Jesus is before Pontius Pilate. And so here it is. We're going to start in verse 33 and work down for a little bit. And we're going to just kind of talk about what's happening here. This is what it says. Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and told him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, here's the thing when it comes to Pilate. Pilate isn't concerned with much as a religious aspect as he is a political aspect, because as the Roman emperor, they thought he was a high deity. They didn't want anyone thinking they were king over him. And so when he asked this, he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered in verse 34, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" So Jesus answers the question with a question. He wants to gauge Pilate, like, where are you at? Where are you getting your information from? And then in verse 35, Pilate answered and says, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" So Jesus, even your own people don't like you. What in the world did you do to make them mad? Jesus answered in verse 36, and this is where it gets key. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." The first thing he tells him is this: I don't come from this earth. This is not me. Because if it was, these people wouldn't care what I did. But it's because I'm not that people are up in arms. It's because I'm not of this world that people have a concern about what I'm sharing. And so the first thing you have to understand is the truth of God does not match the truth of this world. And so if you want to sit here and say, well, I kind of believe God and I kind of believe the world and some of the things they say, you can't. Because to follow God means you have to follow truth, which means this truth doesn't come from anything this world has to offer. It's completely separate. And he goes on and he says this in verse 37. Pilate says, "So are you a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world." To do what? Testify to the truth. So the question is there, he came to testify the truth. What is the truth? It's the gospel of Jesus Christ, which says what? He says all throughout the Gospels, I come. I'm the embodiment of the Father and everything he has done. If you know me, you will know the Father. And they didn't want to hear that. But his message was so out of this world that they didn't know how to wrap their minds around it and their hearts around it. And so therefore, he says, I testify to the truth. And then he goes on to say, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Everyone on this side of truth hears it. In other words, if you don't know me, you will never know the truth. So the reason these people don't know the truth is because these people choose not to know me. That's what he's saying. And then it goes on, And then Pilate makes this profound question. What is truth? In verse 38. Fine. You testify to the truth. You say that you embody truth. What is truth? Now, from what we can tell in John's gospel, immediately after Pilate asks that question, what does he do? Turns and runs. Pilate was staring truth right in the face and didn't even want to hear what it was. Why? Because Pilate's heart had nothing to do with God. Pilate was only cared about what truth was for this world. He was making a political decision. That's all that mattered at the end of the day to him. He didn't care about what happened to God and truth. He just cared about how he looked at the end of the day in the eyes of people. And sometimes we do the same thing. We're like, man, Pilate, what an idiot. You're staring truth right in the face and you can't even see it. But yet we're over here saying we're Christians and we follow Christ, and we do the same thing Pilate does. We have truth right here. What is truth? Oh, here it is. Well, you know what? It's more important about what people think about me over here than it is what God thinks about me. And we try to marry the two. And so here we go with Pilate saying what is truth, but not wanting to hear the answer. Not willing to give in to the answer. Sometimes as Christians, we're like, what is truth? And we know it's right here before us, but we close it. Why? Because now I have accountability to how I live my life. I have to follow someone else besides myself. I may be convicted to do something I don't want to do, but we'll go listen or read a book and follow what that person has to say, but we have the greatest book and we don't want to follow it. And so here we are with Jesus, who embodies truth, staring at someone. And even before this moment, he says in John 14:6, when he says, I am the way, the truth, and life, no man comes to the Father but what? Through me. What he's saying there is this. Truth, there's only one truth. You can't have many truths. Why? Because then nothing's true. There can only be one truth. And Jesus is saying, I am the truth. That is it. There's only one way, one truth, one way to get to God. It's through me and me alone. And he says, I did that by dying on the cross so I can reconcile man back to God. That's it. And I know you're sitting there, you're like, man, it seems so basic and easy. Man, I heard this message all throughout my life, but yet it doesn't transform and change our lives. We still want to say, we want to have all the verbiage down. I love God. I love truth. I follow truth. Then it means there's accountability with it. You have to live your life that way, believing that Jesus is the only way. That whatever this world has to offer will never compare to what Jesus Christ has to offer. As a matter of fact, if you flip back a few chapters to John chapter 8, he's talking to some of the believing Jews here at this point. Obviously, the disciples are nearby. And it says in verse 30 of John chapter 8, as he spoke these things, many came to believe in him. Then in verse 31, so Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine. So he's saying, if you continue in my word, you are truly disciples of mine. Now, we have to ask our question, well, why would he say that? Well, if you remember last week when we talked about love, we said that our obedience to God is directly tied to our love for God. And how do we know that? Because he says all throughout the writings in Scripture, if you love me, you would keep my commandments. If you obey me, you show that you love me. If you love one another the way I loved you, you show that you are my disciples. So what he's saying is this, is simply, if you continue in my word, if you follow my word, you're truly disciples of mine, which means, guess what? If you love me and love everything about me, you will speak the truth of my word. You will live out my word in everything that you do. Not when it's convenient for you, or not when you're just around someone who's easy, but in every circumstance and instance, you will live it out. Why? Because you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Not knowing the truth, meaning you can get up and quote the Bible verses and you can quote Scripture to people. That's not knowing the truth. Knowing the truth means you have an intimate relationship with the truth. The truth is what you hold on to. It's what you love, you adore it, you want more of. It's holding it close by. Why? That you will be set free from death, spiritual death. Because until you know the truth and have a relationship with the truth, there will always be separation. Death awaits, spiritual death. And so he's telling them, if you want to be one of my disciples, you must obey and do what I say and follow my word. And following his word says, guess what? We have to go out into this world, this scary, this dark, decrepit world that doesn't understand truth. And it says, as Paul says in Romans, how will they know unless someone preaches to them? And the problem is we don't have people going out to preach. And the people we do have going out to preach aren't preaching truth. As a matter of fact, in some countries, they've told people from America, don't send missionaries anymore because they don't preach truth. It's feel-good theology. And they don't want their people being misled. And so we have this, we're called to go out, the Great Commission, to go out and make disciples, to speak truth into people's lives. because everything is based on truth. And so as we think about this today, when it comes to this, what do we need to do? If culture has this messed up view of truth, which we know it does, because here's the thing. It says that Satan has blinded the minds of the people of this world. He's veiled the gospel to them. And he's the father of lies, as it says in the Gospel of John. Well, then guess what? People who don't know God are completely out of tune with what truth is. They think they know truth, but they don't. But yet we have a percentage of people who come over here and say, I believe in truth, I love God, I want everything with God, I want to love God with everything I have, but yet they never take that truth out to a world that needs it so desperately. Instead, we try to marry it. Why? Because we want to make sinners feel good at the end of the day, when the reality is they're going to feel good, but they're going to be miserable when they're in hell because we didn't speak truth. And so what are we called to do? The first thing is this: we have to be honest with people. We need to get off this self-podium and say, you know what? At the end of the day, I don't go up to someone and confront them because I want to feel better about myself. I go up because it's what Jesus calls me to do. So when you know someone is sinning, when you know someone desperately needs to hear the truth of God's word, you can't worry about what they think. What are you going to say one day? Hey, God, yeah, here I am. He's going to say, the man who wanted to feel good, the man who wanted to be accepted by everyone. Man, isn't it great that your family loved you and accepted you? Isn't it great you never offended one of your coworkers? Isn't it miserable that they're all in hell now? Because guess what? Offending someone now with the gospel of Jesus Christ really is nothing compared to where they could spend eternity. And the reality of it is this: sin is sin in God's eyes. We need to confront it. We need to be willing to love people. Don't sit and say you love someone if you're not willing to hold them accountable to what truth is, if you're not willing to speak truth the way that God has called you to speak truth. And so we have to be honest. And the reality is this: culture says it's all about you. Wrong. Romans 3:10 through 11 says, there's none righteous, no, not one. There's nothing in you that is good. There's nothing that seeks after God. So unless someone speaks truth into the world's life, they're never going to know it. And so the reality is, guess what? There is nothing good. I am a bad person. There is nothing in me that desires God. One of the other biggest false teachings of today in the church is this: that people believe I do enough good. If I just keep doing more good, God will see that. And they relate it to the gospel, and you can't do that. Because there's nothing in you that is good. And I know that crushes some people to hear that, but there's nothing. It doesn't matter how many moral choices you make. It doesn't matter how many people you help. It still is an eternity in hell if you don't know Jesus Christ. Isaiah 64:6 says that we are afflicted and that we have unrighteous deeds and our sins are like filthy rags. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever had a rag and you've gotten a stain on it, grease on it, whatever it may be, you run it through the wash multiple times, you scrub it as much as you can, you call everyone, you try everything you can find on YouTube, and guess what? At the end of the day, you still have a filthy rag. Why? Because it's stained now and it can't ever go back to the way it was. But here's the great thing. It says that we are just like those filthy rags, stained. We can do nothing to change it, except God, by the shedding of his blood, can wash us and make us whiter than snow. There is nothing in us that is true. It's only through Jesus Christ alone that we can change our lives and that we can be made right again. The other thing is this: by loving people, we have to give them an opportunity to respond. We have to give them an opportunity to respond to truth. We can't dictate who has that right and who doesn't. Isn't it interesting that we'll say, well, that person, I'm never going to tell them because they deserve everything they get. Really? You deserve death. I deserve death. But yet Jesus, in his infinite love for us, unconditional love for us, died for all our sins. It says, if we sin and ask for forgiveness of sins, he will cleanse us from what? All of our sins. All of them. So you can't sit and say, but that person's unforgivable. We don't have that right to do that. Everyone has the opportunity and should have the ability to respond if someone would just speak truth into their life. Now, you can't dictate what their answer may be, but we're called to do that, to be honest and do that into their life. If you go back to 2 Timothy 4:5, or just want to listen, it's interesting. Because we talked about the fact that he says people will turn their ears from sound doctrine, they'll want their ears tickled, they'll go after false teachers and turn from truth to myths. But then notice what he says to young Timothy. But you, in verse 5, be sober in all things, endure hardship, and do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. In other words, sober means I'm not like this. I stand out. So be sober in your judgment in all things. Don't look like everyone else. Stand out, Timothy. And then he says endure hardship. So guess what? Timothy, the fact is you're going to go after people. You're going to speak truth, and people aren't going to like it. But he says you have to do the work of evangelist. You have to tell people what truth is. You have to fulfill your ministry. Here's the thing. If you read the Gospels and everything Jesus promised, he said, people will hate you because of my name. People will not want to hear because of my name. People will despise you because of my name. So the reality is you already know what the outcome is. If you speak truth into the life of people and into this world, they're not going to like you. He's already promised you that. Because what did he say to Pilate? If these were my people, obviously we wouldn't be in this predicament right now, Pilate. But because I'm not of this world and not of this, my kingdom is not of this, this is why we're here. And I promise you, because you follow me, here's what's going to happen to you. And as comfy Americans, we think, oh, but I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to be made fun of. We don't know what it's like to stand up for your life, and have to choose that or not over your faith. We might get made fun of and poked fun at, but really, once again, what is that in the realm of eternity? But here's what's interesting. He tells him all these things, fulfill your ministry, but then go back to the beginning of chapter 4. He says this to a young Timothy, verse 2. Let's go to verse 1. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus. In other words, I charge you before God, who is the judge, the living and the dead. So he's the ultimate judge. He judges everything that we choose to do. And through the appearing in his kingdom, verse 2, preach the word. Preach the truth. Be ready in season and out of season. What do you do with his word? Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction, meaning this. You have to stay faithful to it. Take this truth and preach it. Use this truth and we find all through Timothy, reprove, rebuke, exhort. He says these things over. Defend the gospel. Why? Because there's false teachers all around. But you don't get an in season and out season. In other words, we have to be ready at every waking moment to stand up for what truth is and to share that with other people. We don't get to wake up and say, you know what, God, I gave you yesterday. I'm taking the day off. We don't have that convenience. It's just not there. As Christians, it's all the time. I mean, God doesn't ask for a lot, people. Everything. But what's that in the realm of eternity? You're but a vapor anyway. So it's really not a lot that you're giving up if someone gets the eternity to be with Jesus Christ. Every once in a while you come across something and you read it, and you're like, man, that nails it. And so I was reading a book recently, and I just finished the book this week, and it couldn't have come at a better time. As I was reading, and I thought, man, that nails exactly what life is all about. And so this person was interviewed. They wrote a book about him, and, it gave their life story, and it talked about everything they had gone through in life. But their very last chapter, this is what they said. I believe God is the Father, and his Son is Jesus Christ. I believe Jesus Christ came to this earth and became flesh for us because we have two problems. Ready for this honesty? We have a sin problem and a death problem, and we cannot solve either of them. Jesus left our Father's side, came to earth as flesh, and died on a cross for the things that we had done wrong. I deserve to be on a cross and would be guilty as charged for some of the things I've done in my life. Jesus was innocent of all charges and did not belong there, yet he willingly went there and accepted my punishment. Jesus dying on the cross isn't the end of the story. They took his body down from the cross and buried him in a tomb, and before Jesus was crucified, he told everyone that if they ruined the temple, which they thought was referring to a religious temple, but he was actually talking about his body, he would raise it again in 3 days. 3 days after they hung Jesus on a cross and killed him, he fulfilled what he said. He rose from the dead and spent 40 days and 40 nights with 500 people to prove his resurrection. Some people even watched his body ascend into the heavens, but it was all part of God's plan. Jesus came to earth of his free will and knew what he had to do. He paid for my sins and then ascended into heavens. And right now, Jesus is sitting next to our Heavenly Father. When I mess up, I say, Lord, I'm sorry. I have sinned again because I'm weak. They look down at me, and Jesus turns to the Father and says, remember the cross. I have him covered. Now, what's interesting about that is they wrap it all up. They say, here's what life's all about. Here's who Jesus is. Here's what he's done for me. You want to know who wrote that? For those fans out there, that comes from Uncle Si's book. The very last chapter is him laying out the gospel to anyone who reads his book from Duck Dynasty. So the whole platform of what he does, and he has an amazing testimony if you ever read it. His whole thing is, it's not about Hollywood, it's not about the glitz and glamour, it's about Jesus dying on the cross for all people, and I don't deserve it. He says all throughout the book, all the things I've done, I don't deserve it, yet God still stayed faithful to me, and in the end, this is what it's all about. It's not about Hollywood, it's not about the glitz and glamour, it's not about nothing, it's just people come to know Jesus Christ. That's why we do what we do. And he embodies it all right there in the last chapter. And it was refreshing to read, because usually when you pick something up, you don't get that. And as goofy as he is, if you've seen this show, at the end of it, he talks all about that. He says, if people don't get this, none of it matters. What's the truth? None of us deserve it. We're all sinners and dying. We all need Jesus Christ and be covered with his love for what he did on the cross. And without it, we are destined for death. That's the truth of the gospel. And so you're one of several groups of people today. Either first, you're someone who's sitting there saying, man, Pastor Brian, I've never heard anything like this. I don't even know if I'm a Christian. Well, guess what? Until you love God, all the rest of this is going to go over your head. And you just need to respond to the truth of the gospel, that Jesus Christ loves you. He died for you, as it just says in his word. And he wants to cover you with his love. And you need to accept that. The second group is this, and sadly you're going to exist today, is you're going to still try to live right here. And say, I kind of like some of the things you said, but I kind of like some of this over here too. And you're going to keep trying to live in this gray area which doesn't exist, but you want to believe it exists. And the reality is, the more you live here, the further from God you get. Even though you think you're closer to God by being in the middle, you're as far away from God as you can get. And then the third group of people that exist is people who say, I just want to love God, and I want to love people, and I want to give as much truth to this world that needs it, as little time as I may have. And you just got to keep living it out. You got to keep doing it. It's kind of like this. Many of you have probably gone on mission trips or been part of them. And you come back and you're all jazzed up and you're excited. Man, we had 1,000 people show up at a rally. We shared the gospel of Jesus Christ. We did this, we did that. I was able to share with 20 people, and you're pumped about it. And you get up on a Sunday, maybe give a report about it, and you're all excited, like, yay. You go to your house where people don't know Jesus Christ. You walk in the door and you never say a word. You pull into a neighborhood where you have neighbors that you borrow things from. You have community events. You talk to them across fence lines. Your kids play together. You never share the gospel message with them. You go to work every single day with people who don't know Jesus Christ. You become friends. You eat lunch together. You even hang out sometimes outside of work with your families. But you never share Jesus Christ with them. Why? Well, because when I was over here, these people didn't know me. I could say whatever I want. I'm never going to see them again. But yet the people we claim to love the most, the people that we care about the most, the people we see every day of our lives, the people we spend the most time with, need to hear that truth that we're so willing to passionately and with all the vigor in the world go after and share with people that we'll never see again. Something to think about today. Let's close with prayer.